The whole bunch of them.
Huh?
The whole bunch of them.
Yeah,
will
they are all
invest-
8.
Yeah, yeah.
And please
Welcome. Oh. Wait, it's not on. Test. It's not on. What?
Who's the one that's testing?
It's not on. It's not on. Wait. Testing. Hello. Okay. Welcome to the finals of the MOE-ACJC Intercollegiate Debating Championships. We are honored to have with us today the Divisional Director, Curriculum Planning and Development Division 2, Ms. Beatrice Chong. Please welcome the arrival of our guest of honor. May we now invite the Principal of Anglo-Chinese Junior College, Dr. Sherlyn Chi, to give her opening address. Dr. Chi, please.
Hi, a very good afternoon to one and all. It won't be much of an opening address because I know you can't wait to proceed to the next round. But I must say that this afternoon's activity is something that I hope you all really enjoy and relish, because for the past 2.5 years, it was so hard to have a gathering like this. And now that you have the chance, there's a lot more to it than just debating. You know the skills today, in the 21st century, being able to think on your feet, being able to process arguments, being able to process various ideas, and to present them in a coherent manner. These are all very important skills. So today, I'm sure we'll see a lot of those being exhibited and used today. So I wish to congratulate our finalists, and I'm sure it will be a very exciting round coming forward for the session. So I also want to thank Ms. Beatrice Chong for taking time to be with us. MOE-CPDD has been a wonderful source of motivation, energy in working with ACJC. So thank you very much. And I wish every one of you the very best for this afternoon's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chi. After many intense battles of wits and words, we are proud to announce the teams which have made it to the finals. On team proposition, we have Victoria Junior College and up against them, we have Raffles Institution on team opposition. The motions for the finals of the MOE-ACJC Intercollegiate Debating Championship reads: this House believes that environmental activists should advocate the use of nuclear power. Our esteemed adjudicators for today are Mr. Mark Gabriel, Ms. Na Shermay, Mr. Thomas Simpson, Mr. Isaac Koh, Ms. Teo Eun Si, Mr. Ho Wei Kin, and Mr. So K Boon. In proposition today, we have Team A from Victoria Junior College. Their first speaker is Lisa Lim. Their second speaker is Brishan Lin. Their third speaker is Jethro J. Tan. The reply speech will also be made by Lisa Lim. In opposition today, we have Team B from Raffles Institution. Their first speaker is Trevor Lee Jia Jin. Their second speaker is Sarah Rose. Their third speaker is Chua Yen Sin. The reply speech will also be made by Sarah Rose. The speaking time for substantive speeches is 8 minutes. The bell will be sounded like this at the first minute to signify that speakers from the other team may give points of information. It will also be sounded once at the 7th minute to indicate the other team is to cease giving points of information. The bell will be sounded twice at the 8th minute. After 8 minutes, 15 seconds have elapsed, the bell will be sounded continuously and the speaker will be expected to immediately conclude his or her speech. At the end of the 8-minute substantive speeches, the teams will deliver their reply speeches. The opposition reply speaker will deliver his or her reply speech first, followed by the proposition reply speaker who will conclude the debate. Each reply speech will last 4 minutes. The bell will be rung once at the 3rd minute of the reply speech and twice at the 4th minute of the speech to signal to the speaker that he or she should end the speech. No points of information can be given throughout the entire reply speech. To avoid disruptions during the debate, the audience is gently reminded to switch off all electronic and mobile devices or turn them into silent mode. In addition, we request that the audience only leave the room in between speeches so as to not distract the speakers. May I now call upon the first speaker of the proposition to begin today's debate.
Testing. Hello? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For far too long, we've relied on alternative sources of energy to meet climate goals that are firstly, never achieve economies of scale, and secondly, create environmental destruction in ways that go beyond carbon emission. What is the policy for our side today? Firstly, we think the activists that we are talking about in this debate is all kinds, from individuals, environmental NGOs, and large environmental organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Secondly, we are happy to stand for environmental groups to lobby politicians to develop nuclear energy, even if this is at the cost of other sources of energy. Third, we think we would form advocacy on the ground targeted at promoting and raising awareness of the safety of nuclear power. It looks like partnering with IEA to develop research and development of nuclear energy's consequences like meltdown and fallouts, and decrease how scared the public is of these events occurring. What's the case divide for our House today? 3 arguments for the House. First, on how we are the only side that can achieve economies of scale. Secondly, on how we are the side that promotes the safest form of energy. And thirdly, why advocacy is necessary amongst activists. On to my first argument as to why traditional forms of renewable energies can never achieve economies on scale, because they always remain expensive. Why is this the case, right? Understand that all other forms of renewable energies are geographically specific, like solar, wind, and hydro. This means that it cannot be applied in many contexts. So let's elaborate on what this exactly looks like. It looks like solar energy only working in specific contexts, as it requires large swaths of flat land for very little nations, right? So even if it exists, we think that it's incredibly a waste of space and inefficient, because poorer countries simply cannot use such versatile lands in such an inefficient manner. More than that, we tell you that it only works in countries with long days, meaning it's already been taking out a lot of applicability for a significant population in the world. Second, wind power requires specific wind and geological conditions, such as even the slightest change in altitude needs new specifications from wind turbine to turbine, right? As many large nations are covered in mountainous mountainous terrains, they simply cannot use wind farms, right? We tell you that the wind farms in China, right, and the Gansu wind farm in China is only used 40% of the time because it's located in the west when the vast majority of population is located in the east. Third, on hydroelectricity, we tell you that the use of hydroelectricity from body of water to body of water, it changes because it depends on the seasonal rainfall and temperature of that particular application, and therefore this argument also applies to dams as well. So what does this mean, right? We tell you that every other form of electricity generation from their side can never achieve economies of scale as they do not have international applicability, right? Because of this lack of scale, renewable energies are going to be the most expensive on their side. Before I move on, yes.
Ma'am, just 1 month after Fukushima, a nuclear reactor melted down in Korea. Nuclear accidents are neither rare nor are they learned from.
Okay, later in my speech, I'm going to prove to you why renewable forms of energy are also cause a lot of legitimate harms to people, right? But the problem is that just because of these one instances of nuclear energy failing when this nuclear energy understand that has been developed, the instances of nuclear meltdowns of plants that were developed in like the 1980s, right, are no longer applicable in today's context. And we tell you that even during that situation of meltdown, 0 people died. So, I don't think that the argument of safety is a thing. They can win on the argument of safety on their side. So we tell you that on their side, right, they cannot solve their problems with R&D because it's dependent on geographical lottery, right? The costs never decrease on their side, no matter how much popularity and political capital it generates. Because why do we tell you that on the comparative, no model besides nuclear can achieve international adoptability? We tell you that why can nuclear energy scale, right? Firstly, we tell you that the processes of extraction and using ore is standardized and regulated to be safe and heavily researched because it has been such a sensitive issue in the world today, right? Because it is such a sensitive, people have developed internationally stringent laws, right? Like, for example, the IEA provides international frameworks and guidelines to every country that needs this, right? And we also tell you that the preconditions for nuclear plants are universally accessible to every country, meaning that these guidelines can be used for anyone, right? As we tell you that no matter what, as long as a nuclear plant is not constructed on a major fault line, which is already extremely rare for very specific countries in very specific geological conditions, the result is that the moment nations develop nuclear power plants, all of its research and development are transferable and reusable, which is something the site simply cannot achieve. So what have I proven to you? That we can achieve EOS in a way that opposition cannot. Second argument about why alternative forms of nuclear energy is dangerous for the environment. This is where I respond to that POI, right? Because we tell you that the premise of this argument is that other forms of renewable energy has never, ever been subjected to the same level of scrutiny as nuclear energy has, right? Because we tell you that the prevalence of things like solar panels can be incredibly toxic because they're rich in mercury, silver, and cadmium that leak after they're exposed. The construction of dams and hydroelectricity literally causes mass deforestation and ruin ecologies, and even they can displace and kill people, right? We tell you that the construction of the Three Gorges dams in China, right, cause the immense destruction of wildlife and property. And we tell you that thirdly, when all alternatives fail, when these forms of other renewable energies fails, right, they can cause immense casualties and on a large scale, right? So dam floods in China in 2016 has killed 26,000 people. Why is this important, right? So we tell you that even if opposition transitions to a carbon-free economy, they cannot run away from the other major factors of environmental degradation that they cause, and they cannot show that even in their very best, they're better off, right? But however, we tell you that nuclear is much, much safer on the comparative. Why? Why is this the case? Firstly, because waste disposal processes is clean and chemical-free, right? Because of the process of vitrifying, where people mix nuclear waste with pre-compounds of glass and silicone, which is cheap and abundant material, and neutralizes the threat of nuclear. The only reason why, the thing is, the perception that nuclear power is unsafe is a huge misconception that everyone has in this world today, right? And therefore, we think that our side is the side that stands for safety. Lastly, I'm going to prove to you why advocacy is necessary amongst activists and why activists can create significant delta in existing nuclear policies. We tell you that, the aversion of nuclear power stems from a tremendous amount of fear, right? However, we think that activists can create a change in the perception of nuclear power by combating such misinformation, right? And this is important because politics and agencies can now run on the platforms of nuclear policy and propose nuclear energy bills without the fear of democratic pushback. For all these reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 1 second. I thank the speaker for her speech. May I now call on the first speaker of the opposition team to give his speech.
Test. Of the fallout from Chernobyl, only 10 died from the impact of explosion. The rest were put through the slow death of radiation poisoning. Survivors described feeling as if their organs were on fire, watching others around them have their skin lice before bleeding out. The last sounds you hear are not the detonation of the reactors, but the deafening cries of those around you. Proposition in this debate needs to prove why nuclear power is suitable for a significant amount of countries, in particular, less developed countries where the most pollutive sources of energy, like coal, are employed. They need to prove why it's viable and safe. On opposition, we stand for two things. One, the reuse of renewables such as solar, hydrothermal, hydroelectric, and wind as alternatives to coal and fossil fuel. Our second substantive argument will prove why nuclear comes at the expense of these more viable alternatives. Second, we oppose advocating for nuclear power because it introduces unconscionable risk of a reactor meltdown that are very likely to occur. Before moving on to the rest of my speech, I just want to respond with the two substantive arguments. The first is on economies of scale, and you will realize that the problem with this argument is that it's not specific to nuclear energy. If the problem is that there's not enough economies of scale, then the simple solution is just to develop them to economies of scale. It's fundamentally, they don't prove, no thank you, why there's a fundamentally impossible to do this with nuclear, with renewable energy. If it is a case that we need to transport energy elsewhere, we can just develop more efficient means of transportation. That's how we overcome geographical boundaries. If we want to develop it, we just develop a better battery that's more capable of storing energy for a longer time. Second thing is obviously that if it is the case that it is geographically limited, then we can just choose the appropriate kind of renewable technology for that geography. For instance, if you're near a river, you can use hydroelectric technology. If you don't have wind, then you can't, even if you don't have wind energy. So we don't see why this is a point on their side. Second, the second argumentation is on why alternatives fail. This is not really an argument. All it proves is that renewables are not perfect. But we don't have to prove that they are perfect. All we have to do is prove the comparative is worse, which is nuclear reactors being worse. We would say, no thank you, we would argue that the impact of half your country dying to a nuclear meltdown and the rest of the area being polluted with toxic chemical waste is far worse than a few fishes getting poisoned because of the hydroelectric dam. Okay, first substantive, why the risk of nuclear accidents are not worth taking. The first tier of this is why the risk of nuclear meltdowns is very real. This indirectly engages with proposition arguments that these events are black swan events or that there exist safety safeguards because we will prove why governments lack the incentive and the foresight to implement these nuclear power safely. 4 reasons. 1, because governments are terrible at evaluating risks. We tend to round down small probability to 0, especially for politicians who have short-term considerations. This is why we have had so many once-in-a-generation financial crises for these past 2 decades. 2, countries cannot effectively monitor reactor safety. Nuclear power plants are exorbitantly expensive, both in terms of building and ensuring its safety. and ensuring its safety. The average cost of a standard-sized nuclear reactor is $4 billion. For a country like Georgia, with a GDP of 15 billion, one nuclear reactor is 1/4 of its GDP. In fact, the financial cost was so great that Poland and Cuba had to abandon their half-completed nuclear plants. This is dangerous, as cost-cutting for safety measures magnifies the harms of a meltdown, causing catastrophic loss of lives and massive, irreversible environmental damage. And the international third parties cannot monitor these countries because these countries simply assert their claim to national sovereignty and the right to rule their own country. 3, if proposition wants to talk about significantly cutting emissions, they must debate in the places that have the most pollutive industries, such as in developing countries, such as but these countries like Georgia and Venezuela are far less well-governed and more corrupt. They're more likely to cut corners because of things like corruption and overlook safety warnings, leading to the final meltdown occurring. 4 is that proposition may have claimed we've learned from previous incidents of nuclear disasters, but this is not true because governments often hide details of their nuclear facilities for obvious national security reasons. Meaning they can cover up any failures in their facilities, much like how Japan asserts that the Fukushima incident had no faults and it was the result of an earthquake, despite experts pointing out that their facility was built to withstand much stronger earthquakes of greater magnitude. And our examples of repeated failure proves that we cannot learn from these repeated mistakes. Second tier under this is why it causes massive harms when nuclear power plants melt down. Firstly, there's massive human cost. In the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, there were 134 rescue workers that suffered acute radiation poisoning and 28 died in a ball of hellfire. But worst of it all was that the people that survived this incident developed cancer after cancer, painfully dying 30 years later. Before I move on, yes?
Can you name an example? Can you name an example of a nuclear fall that happened from a nuclear plant that was created recently and not like 5 decades ago?
The point is that these historical examples prove that human nature never changed. Even after one incident happened, there were more incidents happen after. The POI we gave you most clearly illustrates that because 1 month after the Fukushima incident, there was immediately another one in Korea. So second reason, there are intergenerational harms as well. Even if people today consent to nuclear, the future children do not. Thirdly, there is massive and irreversible environmental damage. The nuclear wasteland in Chernobyl is the size of 3 Singapores. All the more reason why environmental activists should not advocate for nuclear power. Third tier on this substantive is why this is especially harmful towards the environmental movement. And this is important because they destroy the credibility of the environmental movement, which is already in a perilous and precarious position due to climate change denial and heavy lobbying by big oil. On top of the layman's preconceived fears of nuclear power, when people see Greenpeace's name next to an article about how a nuclear meltdown has occurred, they discredit the environmental movement, which destroys their ability to advocate for all the other good things that do alleviate climate change, such as renewable power. Second substantive on why green technology is better for the environment. This is a completely independent argument you must recognize, because even if the meltdown never happens, this argument proves why advocating for it is bad and therefore still wins us the round. First here under this argument is why there's massive harms to the environment of nuclear energy. 1, mining uranium is highly pollutive. It contaminates the environment with radioactive dust, and it produces pollutants like uranium tailing that is highly harmful for both miners and communities who live near the mines, and contaminates aquatic ecosystems for centuries. So if they want to talk about contamination, I say that's far worse. 2, nuclear waste remains radioactive for centuries. Aging waste containers have already begun leaking toxic contents, putting communities at risk. 3, the millions of gallons of water are needed for cooling nuclear reactors when released pollutes water bodies and ecosystems for years to come. Second tier under this substantive, why is renewable energy already viable in the status quo? Firstly, it's just really, really cheap right now. Government subsidies for R&D and global adoption of wind turbines and solar panels means we can achieve the economies of scale they want to talk about. For instance, in the last decade, the cost of solar panels has dropped by 90% to $40 per megawatt of energy. In contrast, in the same period, the price of nuclear power has actually increased. Secondly, it's very reliable as well. Today's battery technology means that generated electricity can be stored during peaks and during troughs. And batteries are becoming cheaper for all the same reasons why panels and turbines are becoming cheaper too. 3, the diversity of renewable energy types means that every country can develop a suitable form. Countries with large open spaces can use wind turbines, those near the equator can install solar panels, and so on. Third substantive is why are nuclear and renewable energy mutually exclusive? And actually, this is something they already concede right from first. Firstly, research and equipment makes nuclear work does not overlap with research for the renewable in the slightest. Nuclear research is how to divide atoms or contain radiation, whereas R&D for renewable energy is completely different for them. Secondly, resources are diverted because the capital costs of nuclear reactors are very high compared to solar and wind due to the disposal of spent fuel rods. If proposition wants to implement safety checks or prevent catastrophic meltdowns, this is even worse on their side. As a result, very, very proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 5 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. For those of you who are joining us now on the live stream, the motion is, this House believes that environmental activists should advocate the use of nuclear power. Thank you. Thank you for your time. May I now call on the second speaker of the proposition to give his speech.
All right, thank you. All right, if I'm audible, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. As an aspiring young student who have every stake in the future, who wonders about whether I will live in a world inundated by floods, looking at the 2021 Glasgow Climate Summit, I fervently thought that the world was doomed when developing countries opted out to phase down on coal and fossil fuels instead of phase out fossil fuels, right? I think in this debate, I realized that the problem in that summit wasn't because politicians didn't want to phase out coals and fossil fuels, but because politicians were ignoring the obvious answer in front of their side, right? We think that for reasons of EOS, right, renewable energy is precisely what will doom us in the long run, right? Notice, right, first of all, that Lisa already told you that many harms on their side about how renewable energy does not apply to an international setting, right? We think that EOS is an important winning metric that we have already stated very clearly. Opposition's paradigm is what will consign us to failure, right? They will be the ones to have to answer the people in Bangladesh why they have no future and why their homes are being swept underneath their feet, because their side does not take the answer, which is nuclear energy, which is able to allow international apply across the international standing, even in less developed countries, right? Few things I'll do in my speech, right? First of all, let me bring out the entire idea of like nuclear accidents, right? 4 reasons why safety is not an important metric on that side in this debate, right? First of all, notice there are many current safeguards being used under the status quo, right? We think that there are many single safeguards that prevent all the nuclear accidents from happening. China has hundreds of nuclear plants, but they have never ever had a single nuclear accident. Second of all, we think that notice under the status quo, you have things like nuclear advocacy, research, getting better, and then you have the industry incentive to constantly improve your nuclear energy research, right, to cater to market and supply and demand, right? Notice that this is continue to get better under status quo, just like what you're seeing with other sources of energy, right? And third of all, we think that even if accidents happen, first of all, there are still less casualties under your side. Even if you look at the 1979 Three Mile Island disaster, your 1986 Chernobyl, or your 2011 Fukushima disasters, there are very few casualties on either side, right? We think that it's incredible, it's something that is not as bad as they claim to be. But fourth, we argue that in fact there are more deaths in renewable energy like solar and wind. First of all, you guys might want to question why I'm a lunatic, right? But I tell you that notice, right, that you look at things like repairing and maintenance costs, right? These are things, hidden costs that the media never ever reports because it's not as jarring, it's not as sensational to report all these deaths, right? You go and, if you do not believe me, Google after this and watch Vox.com, right? You will tell you that literally there are literally more deaths caused by all these like solar and wind alternatives, right? We tell you that under the status quo, right, the news media a lot likes to like sensationalize over nuclear accidents, right? Because it is very good for their views and clickbait. And we tell you flip the argument on them, right? On their side, because they receive less scrutiny on their side, safety will never improve. On our side, safety will improve in the long run because when you have all these news medias that constantly scrutinize all these like nuclear power plants, the incentive to improve standards is going to increase so that nuclear operators can improve and achieve profitability. In the long run, we are far more likely to have safer world, right? Next of all, they brought about the entire idea of EOS and how their side can develop EOS as well and achieve it. But no, Lisa already gave you many structural mechanisms as to why this will not happen on their side, right? 2 reasons why. We tell you that one, first of all, we look at things like geography on their side, right? These things will, even if they're able to develop like better technology to apply it across international standings, no thank you, you will never be able to apply it because the geography in many countries around the world, like in mountainous terrains, will never allow you to have things like wind or solar energy. Second of all, notice that they also do not have international standards like we have under the International Atomic Agency, right? We tell you that these international standards is what will precisely allow your less developed countries to to follow the standard and develop nuclear energy, we win on the metric of like opting in LDCs and allowing them to also develop nuclear energy, right? We think that, for example, like France literally has a massive nuclear power, like it's over 50% of the energy demands relying on nuclear power.
Point
We
of
think that's easy
information.
to follow, right? No, thank you. Next, they brought about an entire idea of like cost. But first of all, let me clarify what our model is, right? Lisa literally told you from first that our model is one where, because yes, we agree that nuclear energy is expensive at the beginning, developed countries will start first, right? And notice that because you have things like improved technology, cost decrease, right? And your improved like environmental activist campaign, you're slowly, right, when cost decrease, your less developed countries are also going to opt in and are also going to like adopt this nuclear energy from Nepal to Nigeria in the long run, right? So notice that when smaller like LDCs are able to achieve like economies of scale and develop these nuclear energies on a cheaper level, we also achieve like economies of scale, right? We allow for better and more like sustainable and efficient energy production, right? They also talk about the environmental movement, like credibility under the status quo. We think that first of all, the precisely because
Point of
right,
information.
environmental activists do not advocate hard enough for nuclear energy. This is why it's not gaining traction under the status quo. We have big figures like Elon Musk and Bill Gates literally advocating for nuclear energy, but not your environmental activists because they're afraid of being afraid of being vilified in the short-term public court of opinion, where in the long term we tell you that because like perceptions change, when you allow your environmental activists to advocate for like nuclear energy and show the world a model of sustainable energy development, in the long run public perceptions will change and you allow for like a greater public susceptibility of nuclear energy, right? And lastly, you talk about the entire environment, like idea of like environment is going to be harmed with nuclear waste dumping. First of all, we still think
Point
that's
of
far better
information.
than coal or fossil fuels. Second of all, we think that technology is also improving, right? You have like the latest like developments in like Finland, in an island south of Svalbard, Russia, right? Where you have like a nuclear waste dumping site in an extremely remote part, 20 stories, 200 meters below ground. We think there's extremely good developments that are coming out, right? So let me first of all bring out to my first substantive on why we need to act now with nuclear
Point of
energy, right?
information.
Why we need environment activists to advocate it now. So notice, right, that as climate change gets worse and worse, right, when your daylight hours becomes more unpredictable, when you have more rainy seasons, right, your other like renewable energies on their side will never be able to develop and solve your pressing solve your pressing energy demands, right? On their side, right, their world will never be able to like solve the problem of climate change, because when you have things like solar farms not being able to generate enough energy, your climate change problem is going to worsen, right, as climate change worsens. So it's a vicious cycle that will get worse on their side, right? We think that also, right, when we look at the viability on our
Point of
side, it's
information.
far better. No, thank you, sir. And we think that also as an environmentalist, right, notice in the long run, first of all, when you have an obligation to the movement to ensure a sustainable energy source, our side is far better able to guarantee this, because notice, right, they on their side, when renewable energy fails because you can't apply it to an international standard, because your daylight hours are more unpredictable for solar farms, right? Notice that on their side, right, when your energy, like your alternatives fail, right, their side is going to have far worse political backlash and lesser political capital in the long run. You reduce the credibility of the movement in the future,
Point of
which is
information.
extremely pernicious, right? Because as climate change works, you should need the capital to continue to make sure that your movement continue, because you need buy-in from the general public constantly, right? It's not a one-shot thing. You need, like every few years, you have to remind politicians to stick to nuclear energy, to stick to better, cleaner sources of energy. So notice on their side, on net, right, we are still better on political capital, because notice when all these renewables fail in the long run, right, your politicians will
Point.
literally like have lesser political capital to like remind people to like continue to have like sustainable clean energy, because literally your alternative is failing, right? And all this political capital could have been used for other advocacy things like preventing deforestation. We think it's extremely harmful on their side, right? Second of all, on the idea of opting in with LDCs, right? Because notice that I'm going to give you like 4 reasons why we are able to better opt in LDCs, right? First of all, why LDCs should like choose nuclear energy, right? And they're more likely to. First of all, they have the biggest harms of climate change. You have more low-lying islands like Maldives being impacted. Second of all, we tell you that like less developing countries, right, the point at which renewables fail, they're going to go back to fossil fuels again, or they will continue to stick to fossil fuels under the status quo, which will pollute and degrade the environment. Third of all, it's a global problem. We need to opt in LDCs in the long run. And fourth of all, notice that LDCs will never ever have the EOS, the technology to opt in and solve all these pressing issues, right? Which means that you never get LDCs buying on their side. LDCs will continue to have a greater incentives, right? And politicians will find it harder to balance the climate and the climate and like political capital and energy needs on their side. Their side is going to have more pressing harms in the long run. So right, we tell you why like nuclear energy is better able to achieve EOS in the long run. We tell you why nuclear energy is more viable to the international environment, and we tell you that we have fulfilled our winning metrics. So proud to be standing up for my future.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 8 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call on the second speaker of the opposition team to give her speech.
Panel, recognize that down the line we've told you that enough is never enough. We've given you countless examples of how repeatedly nuclear failures have continued to exist despite public awareness of them. We told you about the incident of Fukushima and how months later there was another nuclear explosion and then another one in a facility in Korea. All side proposition has told you in today's debate is that just because it hasn't happened in the past 20 years, it's probably not going to happen again. We tell you that this is simply a risk we cannot take, and I'm going to deal first of all with the mechanisms they've given to us to tell you why nuclear safety actually isn't a metric in today's debate. And then I'm going to talk about how they haven't actually dealt with the key tenets of our case, about how there's an incredibly high risk of nuclear fallout, and it's such an important clash because of the irreversible and massive scale of harm. Then I'm going to deal with who better safeguards the global community against the risk of climate change, and then finally onto my substantive on nuclear proliferation. So recognize is that they never directly engage with the structural incentives with why people are likely to miscalculate the risk of, why governments are likely to miscalculate the risk of like nuclear fallout. All they tell you is that certain international frameworks exist and public scrutiny also exists. Well, we tell you that the problem is not about the existence of these things, but rather how we choose to engage with them. Often, scrutiny is not enough because governments actively choose to try to hide from scrutiny. They have things like, they're able to cover it up by engaging like aerial drone, by covering up even when aerial drones try to like supervise the area. And the only way to meaningfully identify whether a country has these types of like nuclear weapons is to use specialized equipment that requires you entry into the country. But oftentimes, as Trevor has told you, a lot of these countries disagree with your ability to do that, citing claims of national sovereignty, which means that you can't even go in to check it in the first place, right? So this means that even if there's possibly some incentive to regulate the governments, you do not have the ability to do so. This therefore makes way for Trevor's 3 reasons, right? About how bad government action is likely to occur because there's no way of properly regulating it. He told you about the rounding down of cognitive bias, about how massive financial costs of implementing these nuclear reactors in the first place often means that you have to cut down, no thank you, ma'am, on the specific safeguards you need to measure this safety. This is particularly so for the context of today's debate, where the countries who are likely to implement it now are the most pollutive ones who do not have the economies and do not have the government revenue to fully implement these safeguards. And this is very, very bad because you cannot just have one safeguard. With the risk presented by nuclear reactors, you need an incredibly comprehensive and expansive degree of safeguards, something that these countries will never be able to achieve on their side. And finally, we think that even if governments could assess the risks and impacts, they often have an active disincentive to do so because they're unwilling to bear the higher cost of energy prices in the present, and these costs of nuclear fallout are likely to be borne by future administrations anyways. No, thank you, sir. Sorry. And then moving on, we've proven to you why your ability to prevent nuclear fallout will never improve. Side proposition can come up here all they want to tell you about how technology is rapidly improving, how we're developing better safeguards, but it doesn't matter insofar as governments never have the incentive or ability to properly implement them. In fact, we told you that governments often fail to do this because they have active disincentives against this because they are more likely to conceal nuclear failures at the point at which it hurts their political legitimacy. We told you about how this will never be, and finally, even if they say it's an incredibly small risk, we told you about how this can never be a once-in-a-generation crisis. We told you that governments structurally underestimate the occurrence of disastrous events over and over again. No, thank you, ma'am. And even if nuclear crises are rare, the nature of tail risks, as we've laid out to you in first speaker, is that single unlikely events can have catastrophic harms, and because of this, we can never stand for them. So So moving on to this idea of how we actively safeguard the global community against roles of climate change. Recognize that a couple things. Number one, that we only have to prove that renewable energy can serve as a viable alternative, right, in the present. And we're going to prove this to you in terms of like financial costs and time. So the point at which we do this, we take down all the arguments from their second speaker about political backlash when the movement fails, about how LDCs are unable to access this because of like high costs and how this hurts the overall movement, right? And but we tell you that the burden is not the same for proposition. They cannot just say that nuclear energy is this thing that we don't really have to be that worried about. They have to actively deal with how they're going to mitigate the risk put to us. And then they also have to deal with this harm brought to you by Trevor that was not engaged with about how you hurt the credibility of the movement itself. They told you, number one, that it will always be too expensive, but we fundamentally question the premise of this claim. They tell you that you cannot achieve economies of scale because there are certain geographical constraints to doing so. This argument only makes sense if you implement the same type of technology like across the world. But obviously, at the point at which we implement the like geographically suitable forms of renewable technology within these places, obviously we still achieve the same degrees of scale. But more than that, we tell you that the comparative of nuclear power plants is the same. You have to build them on stable land at locations with the lowest risk of natural disasters and near to sources of water for cooling. Yet these sources of water could also increase risk of flooding and tsunamis that destroy reactors. This is why this is not an exclusive harm on our side. But more than that, we talked to you about how the high costs are just empirically untrue, right? Trevor talked to you about how government subsidies exist, how this has actually like literally just lowered the cost of solar panels by 90% over the past decade. We told you about how oftentimes there are ways in which you're able to transfer technology over from industry, things like long-term energy storage, which are incredibly important to the proliferation of renewable energy, and this is why we're able to achieve these economies of scale. So, no thank you, ma'am. So because of this, we prove, first of all, that it's likely and feasible that you have the financial ability to mitigate these problems. Then, therefore, the only thing that we have to prove, as Trevor has already taken down, is that it's not environmentally destructive. We talked to you about the immense harms of nuclear proliferation, and if they're able to implement the safeguards of like incredibly radioactive, toxic waste, we put to you that these incentives and abilities are symmetric on both sides. But more importantly, the scale of harm that's probable on side proposition is always too large, and that we're not able to accept this trade-off. Finally, onto my substantive on nuclear proliferation. The thesis of this argument is that increased take-up of nuclear power as a source of energy exponentially increases the risk of nuclear proliferation, dangerous from states and non-state groups. Civilian nuclear groups make it very easy for states to develop nuclear weapons. For reasons why. The same technologies to enrich uranium and plutonium to make fuel for nuclear reactors also produces explosive materials for nuclear bombs. Often we restrict enrichment to prevent rogue actors from procuring nuclear weapons, but now countries will have the ability to enrich on their own. Second, beyond just nuclear fuel, technology to build components such as centrifuges are indistinguishable civilian and military nuclear programs. But finally, the same expert scientists and technicians who work on civilian nuclear programs have the expertise and knowledge to also work on developing nuclear weapons. Proposition will likely say that we can monitor to prevent this, but that is not possible for three reasons. One, it is impossible to determine the intent of enriched uranium or equipment that countries procure. Two, monitoring is often done by aerial footage, and nuclear weapon facilities can be disguised as nuclear energy plants. And three, countries can assert sovereignty to prevent closer inspection by the international communication. In the Iran nuclear deal, it took decades of negotiations and massive concessions just to create the bare bones accountability for a known rogue state actor. We tell you that even a single rogue nation with a nuclear program will inevitably lead to dozens of other rogue nations having access to them. Two, but we tell you that even if nations do not develop nuclear weapons, the increase in civilian nuclear programs will also increase the risk of terrorist groups getting their hands on nuclear explosive material. In these countries where corruption is rampant, law enforcement is weak, and criminal networks and terrorist cells are active, the likelihood of terrorists are far higher. Even in the best scenario of countries being responsible with managing nuclear, as recent events in Ukraine show, things get out of control like a foreign invasion that can jeopardize the whole world's nuclear safety. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 8 seconds. I thank the speaker for her speech. This is just another reminder for those of you who are joining us now on the live stream. The motion is, this House believes that environmental activists should advocate the use of nuclear power. Thank you for your time. May I now call on the third speaker of the proposition to give his speech.
In a world which climate change continues to triumph above all when days get shorter and darker, with decreasing sunlight, when erratic weather conditions persist like droughts, whilst the need for energy continues to exponentially rise, when cost of obtaining essentials perpetually increases, when LDCs are unable to buy in and continue to deforest, right? At a point in which no other forms of alternative energy sources serves as a panacea in the paradigm in which we live today, we argue that nuclear power plants is the only way forward when it's the only way of achieving economies of scale. So proud to propose. Two clashes I'm going to address in my speech today. One, on which side is better for the environment, and two, on which side eases transition, right? On to my first clash on the environment, right? Right from the get-go, what we heard from the opposition bench is that there are safety concerns with your nuclear plants like in Fukushima, right? The first thing I want to point out is that if you had listened to my first speaker's mechanism, the safety concerns on the opposition's bench are on the counterfactual is far worse insofar as the scale of the number of people affected is much greater, right? What does this look like? This looks like your hydrogens in China, which wiped out a community, right, of 26,000 people. But even giving them the benefit of the doubt and taking them on at their best, right, we argue to you that the comparative in our world is that when your environmental activists buy into nuclear power, it looks like even more like scrutiny and like stringent checks and balances, right? And like even greater development in technology with time, right, which will continue to act as like your deterrents and your
Point of
checks and
information.
balances. No, thank you, which severely reduces the magnitude of the paradigm that the opposition bench is trying to paint, right? But we argue to you that this is the frame that is far more likely true because it is not bounded by geographical constraints, right? It is not bounded by the number of mountains or like the amount of like vast flat land that your nations have, because these are inherent structural things that you cannot change, right? So even at their best case scenario, right, where we buy into their rhetoric of like the immense pain of like your organs when you're like exposed to this nuclear energy, their concerns of this environmental harms of the nuclear power plants are awash at very best, right? The next thing we heard from them is that there are a risk of like nuclear incidents and how the government lack incentive to evaluate risks and how they're simply so bad at it, right? Which is why they spend like $4 billion on like these nuclear power plants. Here is where I flip their argument directly onto them. The first thing I want to point out is it is exactly because of your frame where your government is so bad at risk, right, that they build like your hydro dams in like these vulnerable communities, when they build wind farms in places which have little to no wind, right, which is why they kill all your like migration birds, right? But even like with your solar panels, right, in like the north or south hemisphere, we tell that these are places with no sunlight at all, right? So this is the first reason that they have to counter, right? The second thing I want to point out is that the Three Gorges Dam, right, costed billions of dollars, but more than that, right, it is inefficient, right? Because and the greater harm that I'm going to prove here is that even with the building of this dam, you still prevented water flow into many parts of Southeast Asia, right? When this dam has built like has blocked the Mekong Dam, right? And you have blocked water, like clean, fresh water into like your vulnerable communities that live in Southeast Asia, right? I think this is a direct harm that you have to contend with insofar as your dams affect countries outside the nation's boundary. Next thing I'm going to point out is that the second thing is that we argue that the converse is likely to be the case, right? And we tell you that the government has incentive to evaluate risk. Why is this so? Because these concerns are the safety of their citizens. And their citizens matter because these are the voters, these are the taxpayers which have voted for the government, which has paid the tax, right? So there's a principle like right to safety and like obligation by these states, right? And by extension of the government duty, we tell you that the government incentive structure is to fear leakages. No, thank you. And to fear like harming the population, which is exactly why, you know, safety matters so much. But the third thing is that this is an exclusive comparative that we win on, right? And why is this the case, right? If it is true that the nuclear had such a great degree of risk, right, I'm going to flip this frame onto them again and argue to you that the government, when they know that they have such great risk, right, they have even greater incentive to care about it in order to reduce your risk. The fourth thing I want to point out here is that no, thank you, is that with your international organizations like your IEA, right, these are the things that serve as check and balances of your risk evaluation, even if all else fails, right? Even if it's true that we buy your frame, that the government has no incentive. So we tell you that these are the universal standards and regulations which continue to apply, which shows how safe these nuclear power plants are. The next thing we heard from them is that countries assert their claim as a sovereign nation, right, and how corruption continues to persist, which is why our counter narrative on our side is so bad. First of all, this is likely to be untrue. I think the opposition bench is quite ironic to even suggest address this. What I'm going to say now is that if it's true
Point of
that an incident,
information.
no thank you, if it's true that an incident does occur, right, then your media still exists, right? These are the things that still exist. Your social media, your traditional media still exists, which means that there is likely to have like even greater coverage, right? So even in the instance like when you have corruption, even in the instance where you have these leakages, right, these are the incidents that you cannot cover up because of the scale of what is going to happen. But if anything, we argue to you that it's exactly because of these incidents and this like coverage, right, there is even more attention that is placed into nuclear energy, right, such that the government has even more capital and investment to want to improve this in the long run. The next thing we heard from them is how uranium is likely to be very pollutive and how they provide alternatives. I think there is a shared universal metric in the extraction of uranium. So even if we bite the bullet and argue that there are potential incidents which could happen, it's exactly because, no thank you, it's exactly because there are far more safety nets in the extraction of uranium than anything else, right? So that means that there's more political capital because people are so scared of it because incidents that happened 5 decades ago mattered so much, and with advocates on our side, we have far greater capability to completely change this narrative, right? But we tell you that this is an exclusive winning metric on our side, as the net political capital is far greater in scale and magnitude on our side as compared to the government on their side, which have less incentive to care given how good and palatable these methods are, which means that governments are less likely to care about it because of how good it actually sounds, right? And more than that, the last thing I'm going to point out is this Swiss example. The thing I'm going to tell, right, is that all these uranium, all these nuclear energy are stored so hidden in the Swiss Alps, right, your Swiss mountains, right, that it's so inaccessible, no thank you, which is exactly why, right, it is so safe because even a regular person, even governments struggle to access it, right, which is exactly how safe it is, right? So this is why we take the first clash, right? The second clash I'm going to talk about today is the ease of transition, right? They told us right from the get-go is that you can develop transportation methods to ease your transition into nuclear energy, right? Or other alternatives. Sure, you can develop transport networks all you want, but it doesn't change the structural reasons. We tell you that things like geographical lottery is not omnipresent, right? Especially among your LDCs, like Afghanistan with such vast mountainous terrains. No, thank you. This is likely to harm the environment even more when there is no cheap alternative because of the vast amount of mountains and clearing or you being landlocked, right? And these are things that are not even feasible to clear. So even at our worst, right, where nuclear energy is more expensive, it's likely to be cheaper in the long run when you have more support and buying in. And we tell that this benefits LDCs because they are the lowest common denominator that we need to benefit, right? And now I'm going to go on to conclude this clash, right? What we told you right from the get-go, no thank you, is that there is no market for research for products because you can't internationally market it if you don't have the capital. And we also tell you that these are the preconditions of innovation and cost efficiency which are not met on their side when they propose alternatives like solar panels and hydro dams, which actually kill a lot of people, right? And the last thing I'm going to conclude here is why this economy of scale is a win condition on our side. Because nuclear is internationally now applicable, right, if it's much cheaper, which means that developing countries can now adopt it to a greater scale, right? So this is especially important because the price per unit, right, as compared to their alternatives, is the first and foremost consideration for any other nations when you care about cost, right? And we also tell you that LDCs are the ones that have no capital. They are the ones that burn forests. They are the ones that carry out deforestation because they simply have no cheaper alternative energy, right? And this harms the environment to a far greater scale on their side. And this is the most important stakeholder that we are going to buy into today. For all these reasons and more, we propose. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 54 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call on the third speaker of Team Opposition to give his speech.
Testing, testing. Good, good. Side proposition in today's debate makes two key strategic errors. Firstly, they make the error of simply comparing and sacrificing the fact that we must compare renewable energies versus nuclear energy. On their side, they told us down the bench that renewable energies have active harms. People die in dams, people have really, really massive harms when we try to develop renewable energies. This means that throughout the rest of my speech, so long as I show to you why renewable energies are simply better than nuclear energy, we win this debate already, because they already say they cannot and should not coexist. Second big strategic error is that the third proposition speaker entirely ignores Sarah's incredibly important substantive on nuclear weapons. This entire substantive proved to you that regardless of the economies of scale, regardless of the disasters that may happen, there are actively evil people in this world who will take nuclear energy and nuclear power plants as an advantage and as a reason to be able to proliferate nuclear weapons, and they actively seek to do harm to the world. She gave you 3 key reasons as to why civilian nuclear programs make it very easy for states to develop nuclear weapons. That the same technologies to enrich uranium and plutonium to make fuel for nuclear weapons also produces explosive material for nuclear bombs. How technology to build components such as centrifuges are indistinguishable from civilian and military nuclear programs. How the same experts, scientists, and technicians who work on civilian nuclear programs have the expertise and knowledge to also work on developing nuclear weapons. Why is this an active harm that occurs on their side? Because on their side, what they stood for when they told you about economies of scale is that we want to bring this to less developed countries. Ladies and gentlemen, that means bringing this technology to Pakistan, it means bringing it to Afghanistan, it means bringing it to Iraq. These are the countries that actively now have the power to end this war. Never engaged on this ground. But fine, let's engage on the real comparative in this debate. Which one is better? Nuclear energy, renewable energy. Number 1, is nuclear more dangerous vis-a-vis renewables? The problem on their side is that they always just wanted to maintain that things get safer over and over. Over time, things get safer and safer. Number 1, this was a mechanism that was not exclusive to nuclear energy. So while dams may be dangerous, dams can also get safer and safer. In addition, they wanted to harp on the fact that all nuclear accidents that have always happened have always been inside of old centrifuges. Back in the past, we have moved on from those days. We tell you factually this is not true. There have been massive incidents in recent times. There was a nuclear implosion in Ukraine in the 21st century. It was a couple years ago. Now let's say, even if we agree that to this point in history, there have been more deaths from renewable energy sources vis-a-vis nuclear energy sources. Why is it that in the future, nuclear energy is still the more dangerous threat? This is because they are the side that's trying to expand these to less developing countries. They are trying to expand these technologies into countries, no thank you, who have the least ability to monitor these things, and who are least technologically competent in this arena. But in addition, let's do the comparative here. Yes, let's say you have more accidents when it comes to renewable energy sources, and you have more accidents in renewable energy sources and less in nuclear power plants. The reason why this is still so harmful is because when nuclear power plants detonate, it's over. It's millions dead. It's chemicals spread throughout oceans in the world. Chemicals and these atoms that go naturally throughout the entire world, that can proliferate, that spread easily. The thing about all renewable energy sources is that they are inherently constrained. They stay inside of one location. The harms of a dam breaking down can only be felt by so many people. One mess up on their side, that's the end of our planet. Now, they talk about checks and balances, once again, applies to both sides. In addition, they state that, nuclear is actually really safe because it's deep in the Swiss mine. Guys, that's exactly why nuclear is so dangerous on their side. It's exactly because it decreases the accountability that we have. It's precisely because governments are able to hide these technologies from other individuals that nuclear becomes so particularly dangerous on their side. Now let's talk about economies of scale, because they said getting energy to the rest of the world is incredibly, incredibly important. And we told you 2 things that were still unrebutted down the line. Remember, Trevor and Sarah both told you those things. Number 1, yes, renewables are incredibly dependent on the location, but oftentimes these are exclusive from one another. So if you have one geographical problem that constrains you from using one form of renewable energy, you can use other forms of renewable energies. So solar farms do not work in parts of the world with irregular sunshine like Greenland, but hydrothermal energy from Greenland's many hot springs provide it from like 70% of the country's electricity. In addition, they never dealt with the comparative on this case. The comparative of nuclear power plants is the same. You have to build nuclear power plants on stable land at locations with low risk of natural disasters and near to sources of water for cooling. Yet these sources of water also increase the risk of flooding and tsunamis to destroy these kinds of reactors. Even if you don't believe that second part, just the fact that there are so many conditions for nuclear reactors means the exact same lack of economies of scale occur on their side as well. Never dealt with on their side. In addition, they never dealt with Trevor's particular logic on why renewable energy is getting so much cheaper.
Kind of
He told you,
information.
no thank you, that it's already really, really cheap. Renewable energy has been getting way, way cheaper over time. Government subsidies for R&D and global adoption of wind turbines and solar panels means that they can tap on these economies of scale. Secondly, We told you that they're very reliable because today's battery technology that generated electricity can be stored during peaks and released during troughs. Thirdly, the diversity of renewable energy types means that every country can develop a suitable form of it. None of these reasons dealt with on their side at all in today's debate. Now, let's deal with this entire clash about activism and perceptions. But before I move on, that POI.
The construction of the 3 Georges dams on your side threatened the livelihood of tens of millions of people. What does your side say to this?
We told you already that yes, we acknowledge renewable energy sources can be dangerous. Renewable energy sources can incur those kinds of harms. But we tell you on your side, the deaths of millions of individuals, no matter how small that risk is, not only expands, it's a far greater harm when it does happen. That's the logic that they never dealt with on their side. Now, let's move on to the entire idea of activism and perceptions. Now, they said that the reason why activism becomes much better and becomes far more palatable is because people far more recognize that, oh, nuclear is safe. When people give activism to this cause, we recognize its safety. Everyone, that applies to all forms of renewable energy that we use, right? If you believe that gorges, that dams, hydroelectricity plants are all really dangerous, well, clearly if activists advocate for those technologies as well, then surely the perception of these things should also decrease. So it's a symmetric benefit on both sides. But secondly, why is it that in particular, nuclear energy has such a low political capital that cannot be transcended? It's because when things go wrong, it's absolutely horrifying. People can see images of faces being melted down. We have the history of the Cold War embedded inside individuals' minds. They associate nuclear with the worst possible threat to humanity. These are inherent conditions to nuclear energy that they never proved can be persuaded out of through activism. These are things that are particular to nuclear energy that individuals are simply not willing to stomach. So they never show why activism and perception increases on their side. We tell you that we gave you very concrete reasons why that's the case. Therefore, we tell you that we already win the debate on these metrics. But even then, why is it that in the long run, and for our countries, we are still the better side for this debate, even if we acknowledge all of those benefits? It's because you have to recognize that they never dealt with the idea that renewable energy sources can be more sustainable in the short run. What they needed to prove in this debate is that in the time that nuclear energy, we told you that nuclear power plants have a very long time that they need to create, right? There's a lot of upfront cost to them, and they have a very long payback period, right? They never showed to you why within that time period, we couldn't develop better forms of energy. They didn't show you why during that period, nothing else can happen. So we told you this long payback period, the inherent cost to the environment that happened to nuclear energy when we develop nuclear energy, those things are never changed on their side. And they never show us why we can actually change those things. For these reasons, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 58 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. This is the last reminder to all those who are watching the live stream. The motion reads, this House believes that environmental activists should advocate the use of nuclear power. May I now call upon the reply speaker of the opposition to give her speech and to conclude her team's case.
Panel, I think it is incredibly ridiculous when side proposition tries to hand-wave away any risk of nuclear fallout by saying that just some mechanisms of things like social media exist. In fact, I put to you that if you listen closely to their language, they sound awfully similar to the governments of these countries who round down a probability of 0.1% to 0, who say it's the burden of future governments to bear, who never end up implementing the proper safeguards. And we tell you that this is so deleteriously harmful because even a 0.1% possibility of a nuclear fallout happening is incredibly catastrophic. We talk to you about the millions of people who live in these countries who now die, or as side proposition points out, there's actually few casualties. So they're just millions of people who have to live an excruciating experience from radioactive poisoning. We told you about how this immense scale of harm, about how it often even transcends the borders of a country when nuclear waste spills into the oceans. We told you about how it's often intergenerational because the risks of radioactive poisoning continue from generation to generation. We think that it's therefore ridiculous when when side proposition tries to give the comparative of a leakage of a hydroelectric dam into a river. The scale and extent of harm will never be the same. This is why the harms are never symmetric. Then we tried to push them on how exactly they're able to mitigate this risk of nuclear fallout. We talk about two things. Number one, ability. They say that governments are forced into regulation because of public scrutiny. But we presented you active ways in which they are able to cover this up. Things like editing aerial footage, things like not letting in international institutions into your country to check the presence of these like nuclear waste. But more than that, we told you that oftentimes they don't even have the financial ability to implement these types of safeguards in the first place. The specific types of countries who we're talking about, again, are developing countries who use the most pollutive of technologies. Oftentimes, the building of like these nuclear plants take up like 1/4 of their entire GDP. They don't have the financial ability to implement these safeguards, even if they wanted to. Then Trevor talked to you about all the incentives, about why governments are likely to have cognitive biases, about how there's a high tendency of corruption, how they're more likely to cover up failures. All they told you is that governments often have goodwill, right? But we tell you that this goodwill doesn't stand up in the structural incentives we put to you, but oftentimes governments don't actually need to have this like duty to responsibility to their citizens because they feel like the cost of these nuclear fallout will be borne by future administrations. So this is why they will never be able to achieve that degree of safety on their side. Then recognize that all the arguments about the importance of nuclear energy is contingent on proving that renewable energy will never be a viable alternative. They told you about the economies of scale and how because of geographical constraints, we will never be able to achieve them. First of all, we proved to you that the geographical constraints are technically symmetrical on their sides if they like to talk about it, so we don't see why these cost incentives occur on their side. But more than that, we put to you that the cost reductions in renewable technologies are not hindered by these geographical constraints. You don't have to implement solar technology across the whole world in order for it to be effective. We talked to you about the presence of things like government subsidies, which have in the past decade lowered solar energy by 90%. We told you about how in the long run it's actually more expensive to implement nuclear technology as uranium becomes increasingly scarce, but innovations drives down the cost of renewable technology. So because of this, we think that we actively prove to you how renewable energy can be a viable alternative, and this deals with the argument of dealing with the most vulnerable actors of LDCs, but also hurting the political capital of the environmental movement. And in fact, we put to you that they pose an even larger risk to the environmental movement at the point at which political capital and financial resources are zero-sum, which means you divert attention and money away from the development of renewable energy in the long run. We think that this is a harm we cannot take. We think that one single catastrophic nuclear accident will mean that public discourse shifts and they go back towards these polluted sources of technology. This can never happen. Finally, they never engage with any of the structural reasons about how rogue actors are likely to get their hands onto these weapons, how nuclear proliferation is far more likely on their side. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I thank the speaker for her speech. May I now call upon the reply speaker of Team Proposition to conclude their case.
Panel, in this debate, opposition has been lying to you. They've been exaggerating the harms of nuclear energy. Understand, you know which side is intuitively telling you the truth when which side has been able to consistently bring forward examples that are more recent. We challenge opposition to say an example of a nuclear fallout that happened from a plant that has been created recently. No response. They cannot name a single example because there is none. They harp that nuclear energy will kill millions when the explosion of Fukushima literally killed 0 people. While we have shown you how alternative sources of energy, like the construction of the 3 gorgeous dams, have actually put people's livelihoods directly at stake. It has destroyed ecosystems. It has caused the millions of people who live in Southeast Asia to not have access to drinking water because the construction of the dam had diverted water away from Southeast Asia in the Mekong River. We tell you that just because these instances are less reported on doesn't mean that they don't exist and doesn't mean that they're not true. Just because we have sort of constructed a rosy image of renewables and believed that they are our saviors, we think that simply what this means is that the instances of them failing are more frequent but less sensationalized by the media, right? Even if we concede that there are some harms of nuclear energy, even if we concede that yes, the leakages from a nuclear power plant can harm the environment the same way as the leakages of solar panels, right? Even this is true, we still think our side is better for 3 reasons. First, we tell you that we're more sustainable. Britain has already told you that as climate change worsens, these forms of renewable energy become less and less efficient. No response. We told you that the price per unit investment on our side is way better, and therefore we benefit LEDCs who are more in need of this nuclear power. They cannot just say that simply building a nuclear power is expensive, right? You need to look at how much electricity you are getting per dollar spent, right? We tell you that not just that, it's not just beyond dollar money, it's also about space that these LEDCs need for development, but now being flattened out and being constructed with millions and millions of solar grids that are so incredibly inefficient, right? We don't think that this is something we can stand off. Lastly, we told you that there's more political capital on our side to make it safer, right? Even if both are harmful, right? Many of you today, I assume, it's the first time hearing that the specific dams have killed specific people. But everyone, I'm sure, has heard about Chernobyl. Everyone, I'm sure, has heard about Fukushima. This is exactly the reason why there's more probability when people fear these nuclear power more, means that there's increased political capital and government's responsibility to make it sure that it's safe, right? We brought to you about how these mechanisms already exist on our side when people are hiding away these nuclear responses in the Swiss Alps, right? And these information is only accessible to top government agents, right? Because people are simply scared. We also have already told you that the IEA has safety nets and fears and expansions for every single nuclear power plant, right? Which is why, and we tell you also that this fear propels people to be very skeptical of the development of nuclear weapons. Like, look how the world reacted when Iran was developing nuclear energy, was slapped with tariffs and a lot of sanctions, right? We tell you that on their side, people are dying and no one is doing anything about it. And therefore, I'm so proud to propose Side with Proposition, the side that's telling you the truth.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 7 seconds. I thank the speaker for her speech. The debate is now over. The adjudicators will now leave the room to deliberate the results now. May we invite our guest of honor, esteemed guests, all teams and supporters to leave the venue now. We will call the teams back when the results are ready.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Just a quick administrative matter, very quickly. There's refreshment outside for everyone. Can I just have a kind little request? All right. Please only